The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon. My name is Laura Brancato. I'm an attorney with the law firm of Littman Krooks, and I'm happy to be here with you this afternoon to talk through our presentation, Long-Term Care and Medicaid Planning. So you've worked hard to save for retirement and make sure you have the financial security you want for you and your family, and you've tried to plan for whatever life may bring in the future. But even the most well thought out plans may not be enough to prepare you for the high costs associated with the need for a long-term care. So today's presentation is going to focus on the various ways that you can think ahead in planning for your long-term care. So first, let's define what we're discussing. What is long-term care? The basic definition is the difference between an acute illness and something that is a chronic illness. Long-term care differs from traditional medical care because it doesn't generally involve treatment of an illness or injury. Rather, it's long-term care for something that's chronic. The main example being something here, heart bypass surgery versus Alzheimer's disease. Some long-term care need that you don't have an expectation of recovering from. And long-term care then focuses on supporting you and helping you maintain your quality of life and perform everyday activities that can be substantially impacted by age, illness, injury, or cognitive impairment. So everything from bathing and dressing to meal preparation and eating or other common daily functions. So where can care be provided? We're going to focus in this presentation on a variety of settings and different places that long-term care can be provided. The majority of care provided currently in the United States to those who need long-term care is actually provided at home. Contrary to popular belief, most people are maintaining in the home with either family support or some type of home care attendant. But there are other settings, and we're going to focus on how do you pay for living in other settings, assisted living or nursing home or rehabilitation center. So the presentation will focus on the high costs associated with an assisted living facility or a nursing home or rehab center and how to best plan to accommodate those costs. So let's define the problem. The problem is that the United States has no health insurance system for long-term care. We're going to address that a little bit later in the presentation, the difference between Medicare insurance, long-term care insurance, Medicaid insurance, and what different types of care those systems pay for and what kinds of care they absolutely do not pay for. Most Americans are in sticker shock if they or a loved one ever requires long-term care outside of the home and even in certain circumstances inside the home. So how does one pay for that care? So let's talk about the financing of long-term care. So here you'll see the graphic delineating Medicare versus Medicaid, private dollar payment versus some kind of insurance. The cost of care is going to widely vary depending on where in New York State you live. Most people may start out only needing a little bit of help. Care at home in the downstate area ranges between $20 to $22 an hour for a home attendant service. If your needs increase and you want more of a supportive living setting, you choose something like the assisted living facility we referenced, that can cost around $49,000 or $50,000 a year in the downstate area. Now, even more expensive is the higher cost of skilled nursing if you need more support than an assisted living facility can provide, and those costs easily exceed $110,000 a year for care in a skilled facility, a nursing home, or a rehab center. So let's talk about the established health insurance programs and what they do and don't pay for. So Medicare insurance, there are so many misconceptions about what your Medicare insurance covers. It's helpful to take a step back and understand that your Medicare insurance is at its base level a medical insurance. So medical insurance refers back to those acute illnesses that we spoke about. If you have a heart attack or you break a hip or a bone, those are acute medical events that are covered under your medical insurance. Medicare does not pay for long-term nursing home stays. So there is a common misconception that your medical insurance will cover your long-term nursing home stay. And under the Medicare umbrella, that's simply not true. There are limited circumstances under which Medicare will provide some care. And this is let's walk through an example here. So Medicare covers a portion of a nursing home or rehabilitative stay if the individual had a minimum 3-day hospital stay within 30 days of entering the nursing home, and the hospital stay is related to the condition for which the person is entering the nursing home. So let's talk through an example. Mom lives at home alone. She slips going down the stairs and fractures her hip. She's admitted to the hospital for surgery to repair the injury and remains a patient in the hospital for 10 days. Thereafter, she's discharged to a rehab facility. Now, rehab facilities are commonly housed within nursing home facilities. There are a few standalone rehabilitative centers, but most rehabilitative care is provided within a nursing home setting. So mom is now discharged to the nursing home in a rehabilitative capacity. Her initial rehabilitative stay will be covered by her medical insurance in the way we'll see on the next slide. And that's because she had a minimum 3-day hospital stay within 30 days of entering the nursing home, and her stay at the rehabilitative center is related to the hip injury that she had for which she was treated at the hospital. So Medicare will cover a portion of your rehabilitation. So let's walk through that. You will have Medicare coverage if the following requirements are met. The first 20 days of your rehabilitative care will be covered in full. There will be no copayment due. There will be no out-of-pocket costs for the first 20 days. Rehabilitative care revolves around therapies, physical therapy, occupational therapy. This could apply if you had a stroke and you needed to regain muscle strength, or in the instance of breaking a hip, you need to regain your strength to be on your feet and ambulate carefully. That is what the rehabilitative stay is aiming to provide you, to put you back in the position you were in prior to the acute illness. Days 21 to 100 are going to require a copayment of $167.50 a day. So days 21 to 100 are going to already incur a substantial out-of-pocket co-insurance payment from the patient themselves. Now, many individuals who are on Medicare have chosen to pick up a supplemental insurance plan, or they are provided supplemental insurance through a pension or employer plan that they enrolled in when they took their job. Now, sometimes supplemental insurance can contribute and can help to zero out whatever out-of-pocket expense you have from day 21 to 100. But most certainly, after the 100th day, Medicare coverage will terminate. And it's important to understand that not every patient is going to qualify for 100 days of Medicare. Medicare is a medical insurance. Your rehabilitative stay is medical in nature. It will be covered to the extent that you are still working on your rehabilitation. If your rehabilitation plateaus or you cease wanting to participate in rehabilitation, your Medicare coverage will terminate. The nursing home will give you a notice that your Medicare coverage is terminating 3 days from the notice date. And from that point forward, they're going to ask you the all-important question, how are you going to pay for the remainder of your stay? And what they're asking when they pose that question is, are you going to private pay? The going rate in the downstate is about $525 a day. Are you going to pay that rate privately, or are you under some other insurance program that you're going to take advantage of? Custodial care under no circumstances will be covered by Medicare, and certainly not past the 100th day will even your supplemental plan pay for that. So let's talk a little bit about supplemental insurance, because it is an important piece of your Medicare coverage. Supplemental insurance is optional. It's not required. It's provided by private insurance carriers such as AARP. That's a very popular one. They work with United Healthcare. There are many types of supplemental insurance. You shop for those on the insurance marketplace. They are additional premiums above and beyond whatever costs you're paying for Medicare insurance. They provide supplemental coverage beyond Medicare limits, and they will contribute during your initial rehab stay, but they are not applicable to long-term care costs, the costs that go beyond your medical treatment. So let's talk about the nursing home costs. Average cost for nursing homes in the New York metropolitan area can range even higher than the $110,000 I referenced earlier. Those are for facilities further upstate, $150,000 to $200,000 a year. And when I give you that number, that's not for anything extraordinary. That's just for your basic nursing home care. This isn't any extreme illness, or it doesn't involve necessarily, machines or people on ventilators. It's not that that's an astronomical number because it appeals to a specific kind of patient. That is a baseline cost number. So back to that question, the long-term care facility says your Medicare coverage is terminating. How will you pay? And I indicated that there might be two answers to that question. The first, I'm going to pay privately, $525 a day, or I'm going to access another form of long-term care coverage. So in New York State, Medicaid, separate from Medicare, is the only provider of government-backed long-term care insurance. And Medicaid can provide care at home, which we won't address in today's presentation, but there are Medicaid home care programs, and they can provide care in a facility. So before we move forward with where Medicaid will provide, let's talk about where Medicaid will not provide, because this is an important distinction. I mentioned earlier in the presentation assisted living facilities. An assisted living facility is not a medical facility. It is not medical in nature. The care there is supportive, it's usually social, a lot of programming and outings involved in that kind of a living situation. Medicaid will not cover your stay in an assisted living facility. So later in the presentation, we will address other kinds of private insurance that can help you pay for that kind of stay. But Medicaid will only cover in a facility setting something like a nursing home or a rehabilitative facility that is medical in support, 24/7 nursing staff, doctors, medication administration. That is what we talk about when we say a Medicaid covered facility. Now, Medicaid is at its base in a program that has a needs-based piece to it. And what we mean by that is that you must meet certain eligibility requirements in order to be considered for Medicaid. Unlike Medicare, where you can access the care without proving any kind of asset or income requirements, Medicaid is a program through which you must prove your eligibility. So your assets, the total amount that you have in your bank accounts, the recipient of that care, Medicaid insurance, is limited to $15,450 in resources. Now that's an updated number, a 2019 updated number. The eligibility requirement adjusts with the cost of living adjustment, so it moves up a little bit every year. And the spouse who lives in the community, that's who we call the community spouse, the person who is not electing to go to a facility, they are allowed to have in their individual name between $74,820 and $123,600 in non-exempt resources. And we're going to talk about the categories of resources here. Some assets are not counted as resources, including qualified retirement plans. So those are your IRAs or your 401ks. And there is a catch. They're required to be in distribution status in order for them to be protected. But for example, if you have accumulated $400,000 in IRA wealth, that $400,000 will not count against the $15,000 limit. In fact, instead, if the IRA is in a payout status and you receive a yearly distribution, Medicaid will ignore the amount of money you hold in your IRA or your 401k. Medicaid will also ignore that you own a home as long as the home is not worth more than $878,000. That's also an updated number for 2019. And that means your equity interest. So if you have a loan against the home, it's not fully paid off, you'll have some adjustment there. But you can own a home and be eligible for Medicaid insurance. That's a common misconception. Now, when you apply for Medicaid, especially care in a facility, there are certain requirements you must meet. And this is the dreaded 5-year look back that everybody always references when we have initial consultations. Medicaid has instituted a 60-month look back for all transfers, including gifts and transfers to a trust for nursing home Medicaid. It's a very important distinction. Home care Medicaid program works under a completely different set of rules. We're not talking about home care services here. If you are looking for Medicaid, you're back at the facility, you've broken your hip, your Medicare coverage has terminated. If you're looking for Medicaid to be your provider to cover that $525 a day bill, in order to qualify for the program, you must provide Medicaid with 5 years worth of financial statements and show that in the preceding 5 years you have not transferred or gifted any substantial amount of money. Any gifts that were given in the preceding 60 months will trigger what's called a penalty period. And the simplistic definition of a penalty period is basically a period during which you will be expected to privately pay. So for example, if you gifted, a $12,000 gift to your daughter the year before you needed nursing home care, Medicaid will attribute a penalty to the $12,000 if it cannot be returned to you. And the reality is most people who make gifts don't give them with the idea that they will be given back. So most times when we meet with clients, gifts have been given and the money has been spent on college tuition or a vacation or a car, not easily returnable. So what Medicaid would do is calculate a penalty period based on the $12,000, and for ease of numbers, I'll tell you that would generally come out to be 1 month of private pay, which means Medicaid would expect you to come out of pocket for $15,500, whatever the private pay rate of the facility is. And then once that 1 month had expired and you paid that bill privately, Medicaid would come in and cover your stay from that month forward. Now, that's a very simplistic explanation that I've given, or illustration that I've given. Most people, if they've made gifts, have made gifts in excess of $12,000. And so imagine if you made a $100,000 gift, you might be talking about almost a 10-month penalty period, 10 months during which you will have to pay privately before Medicaid will come in and cover your care. So this is something that's usually an issue for those who had engaged in any kind of gifting plan where they gifted certain amounts of money or the gift tax exclusion every year. These are things we would have to account for when compiling a Medicaid application. Let's talk about the home equity that we referenced earlier. You can own a home as long as your home equity is under a certain value. The cap does not apply if you have a spouse or a child under the age of 21 or a blind or disabled individual residing in the home. So there are certain exceptions under the Medicaid rules that are given to spouses and especially blind or disabled children. So if you have any category of that individual living in the home that you consider to be your homestead, Medicaid will ignore the value of the home if it does exceed that cap. There are other permissible ways to reduce your equity interest in the house, one of which is a reverse mortgage. There are others. And if this situation applies to you specifically, you would seek legal advice regarding which permissible methods you could utilize in order to bring down the value equity in your home and apply for Medicaid. Most clients who come to the firm are looking to save the family home. The family home, for many clients is considered the asset that they want to pass on to their children, to other family members. It's their inheritance. So we take great measures to protect the family home in every circumstance. So upon the death of a Medicaid recipient who owns a home, Medicaid can seek recovery from the home for the value of the services that they provided for your loved one during their life. And in some cases, the sale can even be forced. Now, here again, we find this exception. Cannot force the sale of a home if a spouse is residing, a minor child, or a blind or disabled child living in the home. But here where it says full value may be lost, that's referencing a situation where, an individual has been in the nursing home for 5 years. It's close to a $500,000 spend on Medicaid's behalf. If your house is sold for $510,000, they will take the first $500,000 back to reimburse themselves for what they have paid on your behalf. So there are various legal ways that we can avoid a Medicaid claim. A number of popular options. Some people would like to make an outright gift of their home, take the house out of their name and gift it to their children during their lifetime. And we're going to talk on the next slide about why we would not recommend that course of action. There are other ways to avoid the Medicaid claim: transferring the home to an income-only irrevocable trust, and transferring the property while retaining a life estate. So let's talk about the problems with gifting a home outright to your children, to your nephew, to your grandchildren. When you transfer the deed to your home to a loved one, you legally have a loss of the right to use and even sell the home and retain the proceeds. More importantly, there are devastating tax consequences to transferring a home to somebody while you're still living. They would take the cost basis in the house that you had when you purchased. So for many of our clients, having purchased their homes 40 years ago, they might have purchased the house for $25,000. And in today's value in Westchester County, the house might be worth $500,000. So if you transfer the house outright to your grandson, you transfer your cost basis of $25,000 to him. After you pass away, when he sells the home, he's going to pay capital gains taxes on the $475,000 in gain without, if he wasn't living in the home, without any substantial tax shield, because he wouldn't have the residency write-off. So if that were the case, you know, almost half of the value of the home will be lost to taxes, capital gains taxes. If instead you transferred the house through the use of a trust, or you retained a life estate in the home, the individual who receives it would receive the date of death value as their cost basis. So if when you pass away, the house is worth $525,000, then they receive a step up in basis to $525,000. So they would have a zero capital gains tax. There are other serious concerns with outright gift of the home. It mentions here loss of the right to use. There are no legal protections for you if you outright give your home to someone else without retaining a life estate. There's no legal right to reside. If the person you transfer to is the subject of litigation, a house in their name would be considered property upon which a judgment could be attached. You could lose your home to a divorce of the person that you sold the house to or transferred the house to. So we very rarely would recommend an outright gift of the home for a number of reasons, including the loss of real estate property tax exemption. So if you're only transferring it in name, but you're expecting to continue to carry the costs, you transfer and you had star exemptions or enhanced star exemptions based on your senior citizen status, you transfer it to a grandchild who's in his 30s, you lose those exemptions and the tax rate will go up and you will be responsible for carrying the higher tax costs. So let's talk about one of the most popular vehicles in the protection of assets from Medicaid claims, irrevocable income-only trust. So the purpose of an irrevocable income-only trust is to protect assets that owners will transfer into the trust so that in the event the owner requires long-term care, the trust assets will not be considered an available resource for purposes of determining Medicaid eligibility. That's a very wordy way of talking about how do you shield what you own so that when it's time to apply for this long-term Medicaid coverage, you have less than $15,000 in your name, that resource threshold that we were talking about earlier for Medicaid. So the irrevocable income-only trust is structured in a way that says the trust, the settlor of the trust, the person who creates it, that would be, let's say, the individual who's planning for their own retirement. The settlor of the trust would create the trust, and the trust terms must say that the income only is available. Income only is available to the person who creates the trust. So with that said, that means the only leftover piece that that the remainder of what's kept in the trust principal, is unavailable. So if you move in a brokerage account worth $200,000 that gives off a couple $1,000s a year in dividends, the only money that you can access from that trust is the income that it throws off. Does not does not allow you to invade the principal. The income-only trust does give you the power to change the trustee. You're going to have to name somebody else as the trustee. The settlor or the person who creates it cannot be the trustee. They cannot be the person managing the money. Basically, for Medicaid purposes, the reason that you will have this advantage of shielding the resources is you're illustrating for Medicaid that you're willing to separate from control over the assets that you put into the trust. And the trust can hold various kinds of assets. It can hold real estate. It can hold outright bank accounts, savings accounts. It can hold CDs. It can hold brokerage accounts. You cannot transfer your IRA or your 401k into a trust, nor do you need to, because as we discussed earlier, those assets are already protected. The principal of those assets is already a protected status with Medicaid. So the benefits to funding the income irrevocable only trust with the house is that you avoid all of the pitfalls we discussed a few slides ago. You can remain in the property, you still have ultimate ownership over the property, and it's reserved for your life use. You can still sell the property during your lifetime. There's no restriction on sale of the home. You can continue to pay the household maintenance and expenses. The trust will actually require the trustee to pay the expenses of the home. And you can fund the trust with liquid assets, as we just discussed. And whatever appreciation the house experiences during the time it's in the trust is protected as principal within the trust. So it's not available for Medicaid or any other claimant to attach. Also, when you put a house into the irrevocable income only trust, you protect it from any other kind of claim, marital claims, personal injury claims. The irrevocable income only trust is a very protective way of holding the asset, and it allows you to maintain all of your all the tax benefits that you had previously. You keep your STAR or your enhanced STAR or your veterans exemptions. None of that goes away. So that's an overview of Medicaid as a provider of insurance. Now, as we spoke about at the beginning of the presentation, Medicaid can provide coverage at home or in a facility setting, a medical facility setting. But what about some of the other types of settings that we touched on at the beginning of the presentation? So let's talk about other long-term care options, other ways to pay for assisted living or care at home, other than having to qualify for the Medicaid program. Because qualifying for the Medicaid program is not always so straightforward. So what other ways can you plan to pay for this kind of care? So we're going to talk through briefly a few different options. Long-term care policy, which is a private insurance policy that you pick up on your own outside of your medical insurance. The New York State Partnership Program, life insurance policies with long-term care rider, and continuing care communities. So let's talk about long-term care insurance. Long-term care insurance can help protect your independence and your assets by planning in advance for long-term care needs. There are a variety of plans and options available through private, independent, long-term care insurance providers. And you would access those through a licensed insurance agent or maybe through your financial planner or any other source of information that you get, CPA. Many people come to it through various different agencies. Ultimately, though, long-term care insurance differs from Medicaid in that it is not a government-funded insurance program. So there are no resource limits. There are no income limits. At its base, it's a private policy that you would have obtained and that you are in complete control of. You can have as much in the bank as you want. You could have accumulated as much wealth in your lifetime as you want, and you would not be worried about look-backs or any of the other things that we touched on earlier. So the policies are medically underwritten, meaning that your coverage will be based on medical history, and that will affect the affordability and the availability of the policy. So you will undergo, similar to life insurance, you will undergo a medical exam, and so the younger policyholder will have less expensive policy premiums. So the timing really is everything in this realm. We don't want to wait too long to investigate this. And I will say that in the last 10 years, the dynamics of long-term care insurance have changed drastically. Used to be that long-term care was widely available. Less and less companies are providing this type of insurance, but it nonetheless is out there, and it's worth considering if it's something that you feel you can afford. So let's talk about what things are you considering when you're looking at long-term care. Let's consider, are you a Medicaid eligible individual? Have you not accumulated substantial wealth? Is your home of modest value? If that's the case, maybe it's not prudent for you to pay long-term care policy premiums, because when you need care in a nursing home, you are going to qualify for Medicaid. Long-term care policy would likely not be for you. And other things to consider, how much can you afford in premiums? And it's important to think about, most individuals are going to start paying for long-term care insurance long before they retire. So think about, in terms of the annual premiums, can you afford them pre-retirement? And can you afford those premiums post-retirement? Because this is the kind of policy where failure to pay premiums would result in the termination of the policy and loss of all entitlement. So you want to make sure when you look at premiums that you can reasonably afford to pay for the policy even after you've retired. Now, long-term care policies will often come with optional riders, and you're going to choose the ones that are right for you. In some cases, the riders are what drive up the cost of the policy. So some riders might include inflation protection, which means that the cost of what they'll cover for nursing home or assisted living, let's say, will adjust each year, which might be an important factor for you. Other riders might include reducing the amount of time you have to wait before you initiate the claim. Now let's talk about initiating the claim. Initiating these policies, as we discussed, they're medically underwritten, they're medical in nature. The one thing to understand about a long-term policy is that you don't just wake up one day and decide you want to access the money. It doesn't exactly work like that. You have to be able to prove certain levels of need before the policy will move to payout status. And what that means is that you either have to show that 2 out of the 3 of your activities of daily living you cannot perform. And what are activities of daily living? Activities of daily living are ambulating, which is a fancy way of talking about walking, how safely you can walk. Transferring, which is basically exactly what it seems like, transferring from bed to a stand to go to the shower, transferring from a stand to a seated position in a safe manner. And the last piece is toileting. What are your toileting needs? Are you independent? Do you need assistance for safety? Are you incontinent? Those kinds of questions. You're either going to have to show that 2 of 3 of those categories you need assistance with, or that you have cognitive impairment that meets a certain level. So that would be for those who would experience Alzheimer's or dementia-related diagnosis. You would have to meet certain qualifications before the policy would pay out. It's not just an automatic providing of the funds. Nevertheless, long-term care policies do provide a great deal of flexibility. So let's talk about the New York State Partnership for Long-Term Care. This is actually a Department of Health program. It's administered through the state, and the goal of the partnership is financial independence for consumers through shared responsibility. And the shared responsibility is between New York State and the consumer. So it's a combined long-term care insurance and Medicaid coverage. And you can purchase through retail. Some purchasers can retain some assets with some limitations. And what this basically means is that New York State provides you with basically a smaller long-term care policy, smaller limits, maybe $200,000, for example, you choose it. And then when you've exhausted the $200,000, you've spent it on assisted living or care at home, New York State will allow you to apply for Medicaid, and depending on the plan you pick, will ignore the assets that you hold. Not your income, but your assets. So all of the things we were talking about previously, brokerage accounts, savings accounts, if you have $300,000, which is well above the $15,000 threshold, if you participate in the New York State Partnership Plan, once the initial piece of your policy has paid in full, you will be eligible for Medicaid coverage, and they will ignore whatever you have in your bank account at that time. They include inflation riders, you can move out of state with some limitations, and this is a really great benefit. The premiums that you pay on the policy are a 20% New York State tax credit on the premiums, even if you purchase the plan, let's say for your parents, whoever the purchaser of the plan is would receive that tax credit. So that's just another way of thinking through long-term care, and this is certainly a more affordable route. A very popular product that's come to the market recently in light of long-term care companies reducing their availability is life insurance policies with long-term care riders. So these are hybrid policies, part life insurance, part long-term care rider. They range to between 5 and 15% more than a standalone policy, but they provide life insurance on one side with a cash value that you can access during your lifetime for care, whether it's care in a facility, care at home, care in assisted living environment, and it comes in the sum of lump sum cash payments direct to a policyholder. Now note, it seems that now this life insurance policy is something that's changing with time, but you will still need to meet the same requirements you would have had to meet under the long-term care, in that you need to have substantial need for assistance with 2 of the 3 activities of daily living or cognitive impairment that meets a certain standard. So this, again, will not just be money that when you decide you want to access it, you just access it. It doesn't actually work quite like that. So there are pros and cons, and certainly you could get a quote for a life insurance policy with the care rider, compare it to a long-term care policy quote, and make decisions based on the factors that are important to you. And the last type of way of paying for an alternate to long-term care that I want to touch on is something called the continuing care community. Now, these are becoming ever popular in the state and have been popular in states like Florida for a long time. They are alternative long-term care options. They're sometimes known as life care communities, and it's a retirement community where a continuum of aging care needs can be met on one campus. So there are a variety of services, from completely independent living to an assisted living or a nursing or rehabilitative care. And while you're on the campus, everything is provided: dining, social events, outings, and activities. And ultimately what you're doing in your monthly fee here is you're buying back long-term care insurance, so that once you're part of the community, you can never be asked to leave. And if you should need a higher level of care, you would move on the same campus, usually within less than 100 feet of the next building, from an independent living to assisted living, and then maybe to the nursing home that's housed on the same campus if you should need that care. And your monthly fees are covering the cost of those kinds of care, and so you're not coming out of pocket or needing any other insurance to cover that kind of skilled long-term care. So they're appealing for many reasons. At the moment, they are expensive. They're not for everybody, but they do offer, they have an emphasis to enable residents to avoid having to move and moving only within the facility when their needs change. And this is especially important for spouses. One spouse needs more care, they're only literally a walk down the sidewalk to visit their spouse in the assisted living facility or a nursing home. So these are many different types of care and ways to pay for care that we've talked about. There was a lot of information presented during this presentation. If anyone has any questions, now would be the time to ask them. So appreciative for you joining me today. If you would like more information, you can see our website and schedule a consult with one of the very experienced elder law attorneys in our office to learn more about Medicaid planning, long-term care planning, long-term care insurance, different ways that we can think ahead for what's coming over the horizon for ourselves and for our loved ones. So I have a question here about the state reclaiming the house. And the question is, you say that the state may reclaim the house. Is this a definite, or is there a chance that this won't happen? So let me address that question. Medicaid estate recovery, or recovery for services rendered, it kind of ebbs and flows. Sometimes it's based on market conditions. When the economy is tight and funding is tight, they seem to pursue more aggressively Medicaid recovery. Other times it's just based on the amount of care that was provided for your loved one. If years and years of nursing home care were provided and the bill was in excess of $500,000, we will generally see Medicaid sending letters and inquiry about recovery, because based on the amount that they paid for care. So there is no hard line rule. We don't see it in every case. We certainly see it less in home care cases. However, we'd be remiss if we didn't say that there are always potentials for a state recovery with Medicaid. So the next question, would a New York City pension be counted against the Medicaid asset test? So pensions and other monthly revenues are considered in a different part of the Medicaid equation. So they don't count toward your resource allowance, toward the $15,000 resource allowance. They're accounted for in an income setting. So generally, we have a much easier time dealing with income than we would with resources. So the way income works with Medicaid is really based on what kind of care you're accessing. Are you accessing care at home or in a facility? If you're in a facility, your income, as long as it's under certain thresholds, will not prevent you from being Medicaid eligible. Income is generally not a reason why you would not be eligible for Medicaid. So I have a question here about Roth IRA. Is a Roth IRA protected? It does not have a minimum required distribution. That's a very good question, and it comes up often. You know, Medicaid doesn't have a specific policy on Roth IRA. We generally make an argument to Medicaid that it should be ignored, and we can generally contract with the holder of the IRA to make what would equate to a required minimum distribution in order for Medicaid to ignore the Roth in a principal setting. So those are definitely issues you would need to talk through with an elder law attorney. I see the question is, my mom is in Arizona, I'm in New York City, do I need an Arizona elder law attorney? So this is a very important point to note. Every state administers Medicaid differently. Medicaid, though a federal program, is administered or interpreted by each state in a different way. So Medicaid rules will vary substantially from state to state. If you are looking for care to be provided or long-term care options in Arizona, you most certainly should speak with an elder law attorney in Arizona. If you're looking for care to be provided in New York State, then certainly you should not necessarily rely on the advice of anyone outside of New York State, because the programs are so varied. So it's prudent to seek advice in the state in which you anticipate accessing the care. I'm just going to give another minute for any other questions. Okay.
Yes, we have more.
Okay, we have a few more questions coming through. So here's a question. Can a defined benefits pension be protected? For example, kept beyond reach of Medicaid. So a defined benefits pension, I'm assuming that that's a monthly payment. And as I mentioned earlier, your monthly income is a different part of the Medicaid calculation. Now, in a 40-minute presentation, it would be impossible to define all the intricacies of Medicaid, which is certainly why a consultation with an elder law attorney is essential when trying to understand, particularly for yourself or your own family, how the Medicaid program applies to you. Generally, income is dealt with in a very different fashion than resources. So if this is just a pure income equation, then you would make a calculation and income would be considered, but generally will not disqualify you from nursing home coverage. Okay, so there's a question here. What companies do you find offer the best long-term care hybrid policies in New York State? So as I mentioned, the hybrid policy is rather new. I would say in the last year or two, it's had increasing popularity because it is a dual plan. It does provide life insurance on one end. And so if you're looking to provide for your family in the event of your untimely death, that, you know, would still be helpful to have that policy amount. But in terms of which programs, it's hard to say. because we haven't seen them really being initiated yet. Part of the determination about what's best or not best in terms of policies has to do with when clients begin to make claims. So we haven't seen that yet, but I would advise to speak with a licensed insurance agent and investigate and compare. This is really a consumer marketplace. These products are highly competitive. You should compare as much as you can the cost of various options and then make a determination based on what fits best for you. Let's see. If you're beginning to accumulate a cash account that exceeds the threshold limit, what's the best way to protect it and keep it available? That's a very good question. The answer to that question kind of depends on how old you are or how old the person is who's accumulating cash. If you're a younger person, and by that I mean pre-retirement age in your early 60s or late 50s, using an irrevocable income-only trust is a very restrictive measure and generally not working. It doesn't work in a younger family. It also would rely on how you access the money and what you need to pay for. So if most of your expenses surround the real estate that you own and the real estate is part of the trust, you can add assets in there and have the trustee pay the expenses of the home directly from the trust. It says here, if a gift is made to a grandchild and the grandchild lives in the residence for the required exclusion for sale of home, can't the exclusion still be able to be used? Right, so when I made that reference, I was assuming the grandchild does not live. I'm assuming that when you transfer the real estate, for that example, the assumption was you transfer to someone who does not live in the home. The next question, how long does a Florida resident have to wait after moving back to New York State to live with children if they need Medicaid? The great answer to that is you don't have to wait. Once you have a New York State residency, you have an address, you can apply for Medicaid. The process of applying for Medicaid is lengthy and a little complicated, and probably could not define all of it during the last few minutes of the webinar. However, it involves the compilation of an application and the appropriate financial paperwork that Medicaid requires to be reviewed. You also are required to provide copies of your citizenship status, photo ID, Social Security card, Medicare card. There's a lot of identifying information that Medicaid wants to see from you before they issue you a Medicaid card. But if you need more specific advice, you should seek advice from an elder law attorney. So let's see. If my wife and I are together in a nursing home or skilled home and one spouse dies, thus eliminating one person's Social Security, can the facility kick out their surviving spouse in New York State? And the answer to that question is most certainly not. Nursing home and nursing home coverage is based on individual status. So even if you're living even in the same room in a skilled nursing home, you cannot, Medicaid is basing their coverage on each individual's income and each individual's resources. The nursing home cannot kick you out for income issues. And basically, the Medicaid is making the nursing home whole for each patient, and so they're not relying on each other for financial support at that point. So the next question, is an irrevocable income-only trust subject to the 5-year look-back period? Yes. So the IOT is subject to the 60-month look-back. So here's where the question comes in for elder law attorneys and estate planning attorneys and for individuals when they make these plans. We don't want to wait until we know the care is anticipated in the next 12 months. You ideally are setting up these trusts with at least a few years to go. If you transfer assets to the trust within the 5-year look-back period, you can expect issues with the Medicaid application. And we certainly have ways of dealing with that here at Littman Krooks. We're very experienced in Medicaid applications. But yes, ideally, you would have transferred assets into the trust more than 5 years before you need nursing home care. So the answer when people ask me, when should I do this? If you're only transferring your home and you don't expect to sell and you're, stable in your cost of living, there is no reason not to, transfer to the irrevocable income-only trust under general circumstances. Okay, next question. Is the payment of a life insurance amount upon death subject to recoupment by Medicaid? So here's the thing. I'm assuming in this question, if you are accessing life insurance and it's part of the estate of someone who was receiving Medicaid, Medicaid can seek reimbursement from the assets of the decedent's estate, and that would include anything that flowed from them prior to their death. So that would include life insurance amounts. Now, whether Medicaid can actually reach those assets or in what way they reach those assets, that's a more complicated question, but using irrevocable trust or other types of trust instruments will substantially reduce the chance that Medicaid could recoup from estate assets. And the question here, Laura, does your firm do application for home Medicaid? Yes, we most certainly do prepare and assist clients with home care Medicaid, nursing home Medicaid, any kind of Medicaid related issues. We're very experienced and happy to help clients through that process. Next question, can you make any quick comments about Medicaid in home? You mentioned costs might need to be repaid. So yes, the presentation didn't focus on home care because that could be a presentation unto itself. But briefly, Medicaid can provide care at the home, and the hours that they will provide are based directly on the needs of the individual patient. The Medicaid home care rules are much less restrictive in terms of the financial eligibility. So the rules there are a little bit looser. There isn't a 5-year look-back period for this kind of care. You don't have to have been clear of transfers for 5 years. It's really just a 1-month look-back period. So it is substantially easier to qualify for Medicaid and at the home care level. Costs needing to be repaid from home care is a lot less likely that would happen because Medicaid spends a lot less per patient. Can you talk more about how partnership program and Medicaid works? So the New York State Partnership Program is basically a combination of long-term care and Medicaid. And what it does is by offering more affordable policies that will, the typical long-term care policy might have payouts that touch about $1 million. Some people have policies that touch $5 million, meaning they can spend $5 million on their care in their lifetime without having to privately pay. The partnership program, the payout numbers are much lower. You choose what you want the number to be, and that will affect your premium, but usually between $250,000, $350,000. When that amount is exhausted, Medicaid will come in and automatically cover you, even if you have more than the $15,540 in resources or $450 in resources. So the partnership is, it makes long-term care more affordable, and it buys you a few years of flexibility prior to Medicaid coverage. And I encourage you, if you Google a New York State Partnership Program, the Department of Health website has a ton of information, helpful links, charts about costs. I encourage you to go onto the website and learn more about the partnership program. Okay, next question. Are continuing care communities regulated or overseen in some way? How does one find out more information and how to assess or find the best one? So again, if you Google continuing care communities, you will see on the New York State Finance website, they list the most popular continuing care communities in New York at the moment. And to my knowledge, they are not regulated. They're not subject to government oversight at this point, although I have to be honest, it's not something that I know a ton about. More information can certainly be found through the New York State Department of Finance website, and I would suggest visiting the continuing care communities themselves. Most facilities are brand new. It's sort of a new concept here in New York, and they tend to sell out rather quickly. So if it's something that you're interested in, you usually have to be ready to pull the trigger within a few months of them, initiating an offering plan for residences. Sometimes they sell out before anything's even built. So it's something to consider. It's obviously a popular idea to live in one community for the remainder of your life. So you could do more legwork on that through the internet for sure. The next question, can you make any, we already did that one. Let's see. Does New York State still have spousal refusal? And that's a very good question. Yes, New York State still still allows spousal refusal. What that means is that a spouse who needs care can transfer all of their assets to their well spouse and make themselves eligible by being under the $15,000 threshold with no penalty through Medicaid. So we talked about penalty periods before. Husbands and wives can transfer to each other without any penalty. And then the sick spouse can be covered immediately. Just know that there are spousal recovery things we have to be concerned with Medicaid. Medicaid can then go after the spouse who has the asset for contribution. It doesn't happen often, but it can happen, and you know, it's something that we need to be aware of in doing spousal refusal cases. The next, and I think the last question, I think we'll wrap up after this question. I am a New York resident. Will long-term care policies generally pay for facilities outside New York State or even outside the US? So that's going to really be dependent on the type of policy that you purchase. And that's a really important question to ask the insurance agent or whoever is providing information regarding the policy, whether those monies carry over. Let's say, for example, the New York State Partnership Program, you can certainly access, there's reciprocal agreements with 45 different states. You can access that care over state lines, but it does affect the amount of money that you can access through the plan. So you want to be careful when you travel over state lines with certain kinds of policies, and you would just have to do a little bit more research or get answers from an insurance agent about those specific questions. So I think we're going to stop there. It's been a jam-packed hour. I've been so happy to provide information for all of you. And please feel free to reach us, the website or at our phone number. And just want to say as a disclaimer that nothing in the handout is construed as legal advice to you directly. Please consult with your own attorney or with an elder law firm before relying on the information in the webinar. But it's been my pleasure. I hope you have a wonderful afternoon, and thank you for attending.